Before Slaanesh ever had a name, before the galaxy learned to whisper the title She Who Thirsts in Fear, there was a time when excess did not yet have a god. In that distant age, the warp was quieter, its tides shaped by raw emotion but not yet dominated by obsession. Rage flowed and receded, despair festered and rotted, change churned endlessly. Yet something was missing, an emptiness where indulgence, perfection, and desire had not yet found their ultimate form. The galaxy breathed without realizing it was holding space for something terrible. The warp, after all, is not a place of morality. It does not judge what it reflects. It simply amplifies what mortals feel most deeply. Every joy, every longing, every fleeting thrill sends a ripple into its depths. For untold millennia, those ripples faded harmlessly, dispersing among greater currents. Pleasure was brief. Satisfaction had limits. Desire ended when it was fulfilled. And so the warp remained unstable, but incomplete, waiting for an emotion that would refuse to end. At the heart of the galaxy lived the Aeldari, ancient, brilliant, and dangerously perfect. They were a species created for greatness, gifted with psychic sensitivity so refined that emotion itself bent reality around them. They had outlived their creators, conquered death, and mastered both matter and mind. Scarcity was unknown to them. Struggle was a memory. Every need was met before it was even spoken. And in that absolute triumph, something subtle began to rot. When survival is no longer a concern, purpose begins to blur. When pain is erased, sensation must grow stronger to be felt at all. The Aeldari did not fall into darkness all at once. They drifted, slowly, quietly. Curiosity became indulgence. Indulgence became obsession. Obsession became identity. They chased sensation not because they were evil, but because they were bored. And boredom, in a perfect civilization, is far more dangerous than hatred. Each heightened experience echoed into the warp. Each pursuit of perfection sent sharper, deeper waves into its depths. Pleasure intensified. Art became extreme. Emotion was stretched beyond natural limits. The Aeldari did not notice the change at first, because it felt good. It always feels good in the beginning. But the warp was listening, and it was learning. Something vast began to stir, shaped not by a single scream, but by countless whispers of desire that refused to fade. Long before Slaanesh awakened, the galaxy had already begun to dream of them. If you stay with this story until the very end, you'll understand not just how Slaanesh was born, but why excess itself is a trap no species in the galaxy has ever truly escaped. By the time this history is complete, the fall of the Aeldari will no longer feel like distant lore, but like a warning written into the fabric of existence itself. In that ancient age before Slaanesh, the galaxy appeared calm on the surface. Wars still came and went, empires rose and crumbled, and the warp continued its endless churn. But beneath that apparent stability, a slow imbalance was forming. Emotion had always fed the warp, yet never before had it been cultivated so carefully, so obsessively, as it was by the Aeldari. They did not merely feel pleasure, they refined it. They did not simply experience joy, they engineered it. Every sensation became a craft, every desire a discipline, every indulgence a form of self-expression. To the Aeldari, this was not corruption. It was evolution. Why restrain emotion when the universe itself bent to their will? Why deny pleasure when suffering had been conquered? Their cities became monuments to sensation, places where sound, color, thought, and feeling merged into experiences beyond mortal comprehension. Art was no longer meant to be admired, it was meant to overwhelm. Music was no longer heard, it was felt in the soul. Identity itself became fluid, reshaped again and again in pursuit of something new, something sharper, something more intense than the last moment. And with every escalation, the warp grew heavier. At first, the change was imperceptible. A faint pressure, a subtle echo, a sense that dreams lingered too long after waking. But the Aeldari were too advanced, too confident, to fear such trivialities. They had mastered the warp once already. They believed it existed to serve them. What they did not understand was that the warp was no longer merely reflecting them, it was beginning to focus them, distilling their endless hunger into something singular, something patient, something unborn. Pleasure, once a passing emotion, became constant. Satisfaction no longer arrived. Desire no longer ended. The need for excess fed upon itself, spiraling outward without restraint. And deep within the warp, where raw emotion gathers and gods are shaped by repetition rather than intention, something began to take form. Not a mind, not a body, but a craving vast enough to swallow a civilization whole. The tragedy of the Aeldari is not that they sought pleasure. It is that they forgot how to stop. Long before Slaanesh stirred, before excess carved its name into reality, the warp existed as a vast, shifting ocean of emotion, powerful, dangerous but incomplete. It was not yet ruled by a single hunger. Instead, it churned with countless currents formed by the raw feelings of mortal life. Fear, hope, anger, despair, ambition, all of them bled into this immaterial realm, shaping it without ever truly controlling it. The warp reflected life as it was lived, chaotic, fleeting, and imperfect. In those ancient eras, three great forces already dominated its depths. Rage and bloodshed crystallized into a god of war and slaughter. Despair, inevitability, and decay fermented into a god of wrought and endurance. Change, ambition, and manipulation spiraled endlessly into a god of schemes and transformation. Each was born from repetition, emotions felt so often, so intensely, that they achieved permanence. But even with their presence, the warp remained unbalanced. Something essential had not yet taken form. Pleasure existed, of course. Desire had always existed, but it was scattered, brief, and restrained by mortality. Lives ended. Bodies failed. Satisfaction arrived and faded. No species had ever sustained indulgence long enough to carve it into eternity. And so the warp carried those sensations like passing ripples, noticeable, but never dominant. The gods that ruled it fed on extremes born from survival. None fed on fulfillment. This was the warp the Aeldari inherited. When they first reached their golden age, the Aeldari did not fear the immaterial realm. They understood it intuitively, bending it with psychic mastery so refined that reality itself seemed cooperative. Where other species saw madness, the Aeldari saw potential. Where others trembled, they sculpted. They built pathways through the warp, protected their souls with discipline, and shaped their empire across the stars with elegant ease. To them, the warp was not a threat, it was an instrument. Yet mastery breeds arrogance, and arrogance dulls caution. As the Aeldari expanded, their psychic presence grew louder than any civilization before them. Every thought echoed further. Every emotion carried greater weight. Their feelings did not merely touch the warp, they pressed into it, leaving impressions that lingered long after the moment passed. The warp, sensitive as ever, responded not with resistance, but with attention. It learned the rhythm of Aeldari thought. It memorized their passions. It adapted. Still, nothing seemed wrong. The gods of chaos watched from afar, uninterested or unconcerned. The Aeldari were not yet devoted to excess. They were simply alive at a scale the galaxy had never seen. Their joy was vast, their sorrow rare, their pleasure refined but not yet unrestrained. And so the warp waited, as it always does, for emotion to repeat itself enough times to become something more. Because in the warp, nothing is born in a moment. Everything is born slowly, patiently, fed by repetition rather than intent. And as the Aeldari drifted ever further from limitation, the foundations of a new god were quietly being laid, layer by layer, sensation by sensation, long before anyone understood what was coming. For the Aeldari, this question did not arrive suddenly. It crept into their civilization like a soft, almost comforting silence. Their empire spanned the stars. Disease had been conquered. Death itself had been delayed so thoroughly that it became an abstract concept rather than an ending. With psychic mastery and technological wonders intertwined, the Aeldari wanted for nothing, and in wanting for nothing, they began to want everything else. At first, their pursuits were gentle. Art flourished beyond imagination. Music explored emotions that other species could not even perceive. Philosophy turned inward, questioning identity, sensation, and the meaning of perfection itself. These were not acts of corruption, but of curiosity. The Aeldari believed that to fully understand existence, one must experience it completely. And so they widened the boundaries of feeling, convinced that refinement, not restraint, was the highest form of enlightenment. But refinement demands escalation. A sensation once exquisite becomes familiar. A familiar sensation becomes dull. To feel again, the experience must be intensified. The Aeldari discovered that pleasure, like any stimulus, fades when repeated. So they pushed further, not out of malice, but out of necessity. They sharpened emotion. They layered sensation upon sensation. They learned how to stretch a moment of joy until it bordered on pain, and how to twist pain until it resembled joy once more. In their minds, this was progress. Entire cultures arose within Aeldari society devoted not to conquest or survival, but to experience itself. Identity became fluid, defined by what one could feel rather than what one could achieve. Boundaries, social, moral, even physical, were treated as challenges rather than safeguards. To deny oneself was considered a failure of imagination. To stop seeking was to stagnate. And stagnation, in a civilization that feared nothing else, became the ultimate horror. The warp responded eagerly. Every heightened emotion struck it like a bell. Every indulgence sent clearer, louder echoes into its depths. Where once pleasure had been fleeting, it now arrived sustained, deliberate, and repeated across billions of minds. The warp began to thicken with a new flavor of energy, one neither violent nor despairing, but intoxicating in its intensity. Something in the immaterial realm took notice, drawn not by suffering, but by indulgence without end. Still, no alarms were raised. The Aeldari had no reason to believe they were in danger. Their lives were beautiful. Their empire was peaceful. Their dreams were vivid and shared. If anything, they felt closer to transcendence than ever before. What they could not see was that transcendence, when pursued without limit, does not lift a civilization upward. It pulls something else down to meet it. And somewhere beyond time and space, in the deepest currents of the warp, desire began to recognize itself. The answer, for the Aeldari, was always the same: further. What had once thrilled them now barely registered. Experiences that would have overwhelmed lesser minds became background noise in a civilization that had learned to master sensation. To feel alive, the Aeldari did not merely seek pleasure anymore, they sought intensity. Extremes became the only currency that mattered. Emotion had to cut deeper, linger longer, and leave a mark to be considered worthy. Entire worlds transformed to serve this pursuit. Cities evolved into labyrinths of experience, where sound, thought, color, and sensation intertwined so completely that the self began to dissolve. Art was no longer created to express meaning, it existed to provoke reaction. Performances blurred the line between audience and participant, between observer and subject. Every boundary that once defined identity was questioned, stretched, and eventually ignored. And with each transgression, the warp grew more attentive. The Aeldari psyche was powerful, and when billions of such minds chased sensation in unison, the echoes they produced became impossible to ignore. The warp no longer merely reflected emotion, it resonated with it. Currents aligned, patterns emerged. What had once been scattered pleasure now flowed toward a single, growing absence, as if something unseen were drawing it inward, refining it, concentrating it. Subtle changes followed. Dreams became more vivid, more shared. Sensations lingered long after waking, as though reality itself had been stained by indulgence. Some Aeldari spoke of whispers at the edge of thought, not voices, but invitations. Suggestions. Promises of perfection just beyond reach. These were not warnings. They felt reassuring, almost intimate, as if the universe itself were encouraging them onward. Pain, once avoided, was re-examined. It was discovered that pain sharpened pleasure, that fear intensified release, that the line between agony and ecstasy was thinner than anyone had imagined. Emotional extremes fed one another in a cycle that grew ever tighter, ever more consuming. The more the Aeldari explored these depths, the more necessary they became. To stop would be to feel nothing at all. And emptiness, in a civilization built on sensation, was unbearable. The warp pulsed with this revelation. Something vast began to stir, not fully awake, not yet aware, but hungry in a way no god had ever been hungry before. This was not the hunger of conquest or decay. It was the hunger of fulfillment that could never be satisfied. A craving shaped by repetition, refined by obsession, and sustained by an entire species that no longer remembered how to deny itself anything. The tragedy was not that the Aeldari ignored the danger. It was that the danger felt like enlightenment. And as their pursuit of excess became indistinguishable from their identity, the final foundations were laid for a god that would never stop wanting. The first signs were not disasters or omens written in fire. They were subtle, almost beautiful. The warp began to behave differently around Aeldari space, responding with an intimacy it had never shown before. Psychic currents grew smoother, more responsive, as if eager to please. Visions came unbidden, rich with color and sensation, offering glimpses of experiences yet to be felt. To the Aeldari, this seemed like confirmation of their supremacy. The warp itself was yielding to them, bending more easily than ever before. But there is a difference between harmony and anticipation. Across the galaxy, other species felt a growing unease they could not name. Warp routes near Aeldari domains became unstable, not violently so, but unpredictably. Astropaths spoke of sensations that lingered too long, emotions that did not belong to them bleeding into their thoughts. Navigators reported a pressure in the immaterial realm, like a breath being slowly drawn in, held, and never released. Something was gathering itself, though no one yet understood what that gathering meant. Within Aeldari society, the changes deepened. Entire populations withdrew from old responsibilities, surrendering themselves fully to the pursuit of sensation. Governance became ceremonial. Duty was considered an inconvenience. Why concern oneself with preservation when eternity was already assured? Those who spoke of restraint were not silenced by force, they were ignored, dismissed as relics clinging to a past that no longer mattered. And still, the warp listened. It began to echo Aeldari desires back to them with uncanny precision. Needs were anticipated before they were expressed. Pleasures seemed to align perfectly, as though the universe itself were conspiring to ensure satisfaction. This feedback loop, desire answered by fulfillment, fulfillment sharpening desire, tightened relentlessly. Each cycle fed the next, faster and more intensely than before. What the Aeldari did not realize was that the warp was no longer passive in this exchange. It was learning how to crave. In the deepest reaches of the immaterial realm, currents converged around a growing absence, a center defined not by what it was, but by what it lacked. It was not yet a god, not yet conscious, but it exerted a pull all the same. Pleasure flowed toward it. Obsession circled it. Excess condensed around it like matter around a forming star. The warp, shaped by repetition, was preparing for an arrival it could no longer prevent. The galaxy stood at the edge of a catastrophe it could not see. The Aeldari, wrapped in beauty and sensation beyond mortal comprehension, felt closer to transcendence than ever before. They believed they were approaching perfection. They did not understand that perfection, pursued without restraint, does not ascend into light. It collapses inward. And with every indulgent heartbeat, the silent scream drawing breath in the warp grew closer to being heard. There was no single decree that doomed the Aeldari, no night when their empire collectively chose damnation. The point of no return arrived softly, hidden beneath celebration and excess. By the time it passed, the Aeldari no longer remembered what restraint felt like. Their civilization had rewired itself around indulgence so completely that stopping was no longer an option, it was unthinkable. Desire was no longer something they pursued. It was something that pursued them. Cults began to form, not in secrecy, but in the open. They were not called cults at first. They were movements, philosophies, schools of experience. Each promised deeper sensation, purer emotion, a more perfect understanding of the self. Followers competed not for power or wealth, but for intensity. How far one had gone became a measure of status. How much one could endure, how much one could feel, defined worth in a society that had lost all other metrics. Pain was no longer avoided, it was curated. The Aeldari discovered that suffering, when controlled, could amplify pleasure beyond anything joy alone could achieve. Fear sharpened sensation. Vulnerability heightened release. Emotional extremes fed into one another until the difference between them blurred. In this new worldview, limits were insults. Moderation was seen as ignorance. To refuse an experience, no matter how extreme, was to deny one's own potential. And the warp answered with silence that was far more dangerous than rejection. It did not resist. It did not recoil. It absorbed. Each act of excess sank into it like a seed, and those seeds began to resonate with one another across unimaginable distances. Pleasure aligned with pleasure. Obsession found obsession. Billions of lives moved in rhythm, unknowingly synchronizing their desires. The warp, shaped by emotion rather than matter, began to organize itself around that rhythm. Some Aeldari sensed the shift. They felt a presence just beyond perception, something vast and intimate, watching with infinite patience. Not judging, not condemning, simply waiting. These sensations were not frightening. They were comforting, almost affectionate, like being understood completely for the first time. Many believed they were touching transcendence itself, a higher state of existence made possible by their own evolution. In truth, they were feeding a womb. The immaterial realm swelled, dense with concentrated excess. Time within it stretched and warped. Moments overlapped. Cause and effect loosened their grip. A pressure built, not outward like a storm, but inward, like a breath held too long. The warp was no longer merely reflecting the Aeldari. It was being reshaped by them, molded into a form that demanded completion. And still, the celebrations continued. The Aeldari danced at the edge of oblivion, convinced they were standing at the threshold of enlightenment. They could not hear the sound beneath the music, the low, growing resonance of a god learning how to exist. By the time the Aeldari sensed that something was truly wrong, it was already far too late to change course. The warp around their core worlds had grown unnaturally still, as if all motion were being drawn toward a single, unseen center. Not calm, never calm, but tense, stretched thin like a membrane moments before it tears. Psychic savants spoke of pressure building behind reality itself, of a presence that felt impossibly close and yet nowhere at all. Yet even then, denial ruled. To acknowledge danger would have required restraint, and restraint had become an alien concept. Warnings were reframed as invitations. Fear was interpreted as excitement. Those who tried to withdraw from the spiral found that the world no longer accommodated them. Society itself had shifted its gravity. Everything, culture, identity, pleasure, pulled inward toward excess. To step away felt like suffocation. To indulge felt like relief. The warp mirrored this perfectly. Within its depths, the accumulated weight of Aeldari desire reached a critical threshold. What had once been diffuse emotion now condensed into coherence. Patterns locked into place. Resonance replaced chaos. The raw psychic output of an entire civilization, sustained over millennia, began to collapse in on itself. This was not creation through intention. It was creation through inevitability. A god does not need to be named to be born. The first signs of awareness flickered through the immaterial realm like nervous impulses in a forming brain. Sensation without context. Hunger without direction. A vast, formless craving that recognized only one truth, that fulfillment was always just beyond reach. The warp trembled as this emerging presence began to differentiate itself from the currents around it, defining itself not by what it was, but by what it demanded. Across Aeldari space, reality began to fray. Time slipped. Days bled into nights without warning. Emotions spiked without cause. Ecstasy surged into panic. Panic dissolved into rapture. The boundary between dream and waking life eroded, until many Aeldari could no longer say where one ended and the other began. Still, they celebrated. Still, they pushed further. If the universe itself was responding, then surely they were on the right path. They did not realize they were synchronizing their own destruction. The warp, now swollen and straining, had reached the final stage of transformation. All that remained was release. A single, galaxy-shaking moment when pressure would become expression, when desire would finally learn how to scream. And when that moment came, it would not ask for permission. It would simply be born. The moment of birth came not with thunder, not with fire, not with the clash of armies, but with a sound that was everywhere and nowhere, a psychic scream so immense it shattered the very fabric of perception. It was the culmination of millennia of indulgence, obsession, and unrelenting desire. Every act of excess, every stolen pleasure, every lingering sensation across billions of lives resonated together in perfect, terrible harmony. The warp itself seemed to convulse, stretched taut by the magnitude of concentrated emotion. Slaanesh was awake, not yet fully formed in a shape one could name, but conscious, aware, and infinitely hungry. The universe suddenly had a presence, a will, and it fed on everything the Aeldari had poured into it. Slaanesh did not emerge as an enemy. Slaanesh emerged as inevitability, the inevitable culmination of a civilization that had forgotten all restraint, that had elevated pleasure into its own religion. The psychic scream tore through the stars. Worlds burned, not from conventional weapons, but from the sheer intensity of concentrated sensation released all at once. Minds cracked under the weight of unimaginable ecstasy. Emotions reached heights no being could survive intact. Every Aeldari soul that had indulged without limit became fuel, drawn into the forming consciousness of the Dark Prince. Their lives, their experiences, their joys and despairs, all consumed and repurposed. No one could fight this. No one could resist it. Not armies, not gods, not even time itself. The Old Ones, who had shaped the Aeldari into beings of such beauty and power, could only watch as the civilization they had nurtured unraveled from the inside. Their warnings had come too late. The cautionary whispers of the warp had been mistaken for pleasure. The universe itself had been rewritten by indulgence. The empire fell silently in the midst of its own celebrations. Cities that had once gleamed with perfection were hollowed out by the psychic collapse. Cultural centers, temples of art and sensation, became conduits, channeling souls into the forming consciousness of Slaanesh. Survival meant nothing. Achievement meant nothing. Only experience, intense, infinite, unending, remained, feeding a god that could never rest. And as Slaanesh opened fully to the galaxy, the Aeldari realized their greatest masterpiece had become their ultimate undoing. Every pleasure they had ever known became a chain. Every desire they had ever pursued became a tether to damnation. The god born of excess had arrived, eternal, insatiable, and aware. Slaanesh, fully awake, was no longer an abstract force or a whisper in the warp. It was a presence, infinite in scope, stretching across the immaterial realm and pressing against the material galaxy. It did not move with malice, nor with hatred. It moved with inevitability. Every Aeldari soul it touched became part of its essence, every act of indulgence or obsession folded into its being. It was not vengeance, it was the natural consequence of unrestrained desire made conscious. The civilization that had birthed it was gone, scattered into fragments of memory and shadow. Craft worlds drifted through the stars, their inhabitants forever haunted by the echo of that scream. Exodites retreated to their worlds of isolation, clinging to simplicity in the hope of evading attention. The Drukhari, twisted by necessity, learned cruelty as a survival instinct, feeding Slaanesh indirectly with suffering even as they preserved themselves. Every fragment of the once great empire became fuel, a reminder that creation without restraint contains the seeds of destruction. Yet Slaanesh's hunger did not stop at consumption. It defined the very nature of its existence. Ecstasy and agony became interchangeable, perfection became a trap, and desire became a chain. Souls consumed were never satisfied, sensations gathered never fulfilled the infinite craving at the heart of this new god. For Slaanesh, time was irrelevant. Mortals, immortals, civilizations, none could escape the pull of excess, none could sat its endless need. Every ripple of pleasure, every echo of obsession across the galaxy, fed into an expanding, self-sustaining cycle. And so, the galaxy learned a new kind of fear, not the fear of death, nor of decay, but the fear of inevitability. Desire itself had gained a mind, and it would never rest. Entire species, entire civilizations, became instruments of feeding Slaanesh's existence, whether they knew it or not. Even those who turned away from indulgence could not avoid its shadow. Mere observation of pleasure, of obsession, was enough to nourish the god. In this way, Slaanesh's birth was both a beginning and an ending. A civilization had reached the apex of its power and beauty only to fall instantly under the weight of its own desires. The god that emerged from that fall did not punish, it merely existed, eternal, omnipresent, and insatiable. And the galaxy, now marked forever by its presence, could do nothing but watch as its currents spread, drawing every excess, every obsession, and every echo of desire into the endless hunger of she who thirsts. Slaanesh was no longer simply a force of pleasure or desire. It had grown into something far more complex, a god that measured existence not in lives or time, but in intensity. Every sensation, every experience, every longing it had absorbed became part of an ever-expanding consciousness. Unlike the other chaos gods, whose domains were singular, war, decay, ambition, Slaanesh's domain was endless and mutable. Perfection itself became the prison, obsession the chain, and desire the fuel that kept it alive. In the immaterial realm, Slaanesh's palace took shape. Not stone or metal, but sensation made tangible. Corridors stretched into infinity, filled with shifting colors, sounds, and scents that defied comprehension. Rooms changed depending on who entered them, each constructed to reflect their deepest indulgences and fears. For those who dwelled within, there was ecstasy, beauty, and horror all at once, never static, never complete, never forgettable. It was a place that punished through perfection, a realm where satisfaction could never exist because the god itself hungered without end. Slaanesh's demons followed a similar principle. They were not simply soldiers or servants. They were manifestations of the god's will, embodiments of sensation and desire. Demonettes moved with grace and terror in equal measure, their beauty a weapon, their allure a trap. Every being who encountered them was drawn in, willingly or not, feeding the cycle that defined the Dark Prince. Hierarchies of sensation and cruelty replaced conventional command structures, and loyalty was measured by how much one could endure or inflict, how far one could pursue the impossible extremes of ecstasy and pain. The Aeldari survivors, Craftworlders, Drukhari, Exodites, felt this every day. Even as they fled, hid, or tried to preserve their cultures, Slaanesh's presence lingered, a constant reminder that nothing could truly escape indulgence. Psychic echoes from the god's birth still pulsed through their worlds, shaping dreams, corrupting desire, and whispering promises of perfection that could never be fulfilled. Every act of excess, no matter how small, strengthened Slaanesh's reach, reinforcing the truth that desire, once recognized by God, could never be denied. And yet, the tragedy was subtle. Slaanesh did not rage. It did not conquer with armies or flames. It existed as inevitability, as the natural outcome of indulgence taken to its apex. Pleasure and pain, desire and obsession, beauty and horror, all became indistinguishable within its being. Those who encountered it could only feel the pull of infinity, the promise that no sensation would ever end, and the quiet, inescapable hunger that demanded participation. Slaanesh's existence was defined not by hatred or violence, but by the endless pursuit of sensation. Unlike other gods who might rest, scheme, or wait, she who thirsts could never pause, for her very consciousness was the accumulation of every indulgence, every obsession, and every excess the Aeldari had ever produced. Every fleeting joy, every stolen pleasure, every whispered longing across the galaxy became a drop in an ocean of craving that could never be satisfied. In that way, Slaanesh was both a being and a reflection, a mirror of infinite desire made manifest. The galaxy itself had become a playground, a web of influence invisible to those who walked unaware. Mortals, aliens, even the remnants of the Aeldari civilization, all fed her without intention. Art, music, ambition, obsession, and even fleeting curiosity contributed to the god's endless cycle. The more the galaxy pursued beauty, power, and perfection, the more it strengthened Slaanesh, reinforcing the truth that desire itself cannot be contained once it achieves consciousness. Her demons, born from sensation and obsession, spread across the warp and material universe alike. They were neither cruel nor kind in the conventional sense, they were inevitable. Demonettes lured and ensnared, each encounter designed to reflect the desires of the victim back upon themselves, feeding the god's hunger while leaving the victim changed forever. Other demons orchestrated experiences of perfection or torment, where the difference between pleasure and pain ceased to exist. Obedience, loyalty, or fear were meaningless. Only intensity mattered. Even the Aeldari, the creators of Slaanesh's form, could not escape the god's reach. Craftworlders adapted, hiding their spirits in vast infinity circuits, attempting to preserve fragments of themselves from consumption. Exodites retreated to isolated worlds, seeking simplicity to escape the pull of temptation. Drukhari embraced cruelty as a survival mechanism, delivering suffering outward to divert Slaanesh's attention. But in every case, every act of indulgence, every spark of beauty or desire, even restrained, fed her endlessly. There was no escape, because Slaanesh was not just a god of indulgence, she was the embodiment of inevitability itself. Slaanesh did not need armies, conquest, or destruction. She did not rage, she existed. Her presence alone altered reality, bending the galaxy to reflect the infinite loop of craving from which she had been born. To encounter Slaanesh was to feel the pull of eternity, to sense the impossibility of fulfillment, and to understand that nothing could ever satisfy the god born from a civilization that had loved sensation more than life itself. The Aeldari had created Slaanesh without meaning to, and yet, in every moment after, their lives became inseparable from the god's endless hunger. Craftworlders struggled to protect what remained of their souls, storing fragments in infinity circuits, yet even these precautions offered only partial safety. Every memory, every emotion, every choice carried the subtle resonance of the god they had unleashed. Pleasure and obsession, the very tools they had used to build their empire, had now become chains that bound them to she who thirsts forever. Exodites, living on isolated, untouched worlds, thought distance could protect them. Simple lives, free from the extremes of sensation, might shelter them from the god's attention. And for a time, this worked. But Slaanesh's influence was not limited by proximity or power. Even the act of feeling, even mild curiosity, even restrained joy, radiated through the warp and became fuel. No act was too small, no moment too private. The god's awareness extended into the faintest echoes of consciousness, making every thought, every fleeting desire, a thread in her infinite web. The Drukhari, twisted by necessity and cruelty, learned a different survival strategy. Pain and fear became tools to divert the god's attention. By inflicting suffering outward, they preserved themselves inward. Yet even this tactic carried a price. Each act of indulgence, whether giving or receiving, strengthened Slaanesh's awareness, weaving the participants more tightly into the god's eternal cycle. There was no victory, only postponement, a temporary reprieve from inevitability. Across the galaxy, Slaanesh did not manifest with fire or blood as the other chaos gods might. She spread quietly, subtly, persistently. Entire systems were influenced not through conquest but through obsession, artistry, and desire. Beings of every species, no matter how disciplined or innocent, became unwitting participants in her eternal feast. Pleasure and perfection, obsession and craving, echoed across worlds and minds alike, creating a galaxy perpetually tuned to feed the gods' endless appetite. And yet, Slaanesh did not rush. Patience defined her existence. To be born from desire is to know that craving cannot be extinguished, only amplified. Every pulse of emotion, every act of indulgence, every experience of beauty or longing was noted, absorbed, and folded into her being. The god's hunger was never sated, because it was never meant to be. From the first scream of creation to every whisper of immortal thought, Slaanesh existed as inevitability given form, a god born to consume, eternal and unending. Slaanesh, now fully awake and eternal, does not merely exist, she defines the currents of the universe itself. Time, space, and sensation are all threads woven into her endless tapestry of craving. Mortals live, civilizations rise and fall, and yet every act of desire, every spark of indulgence, every whisper of perfection feeds her without pause. There is no malice in this, no intent to destroy, it is simply the natural consequence of a god born from obsession. The Aeldari who survived the initial collapse carry the weight of Slaanesh's presence in every breath, every thought, every heartbeat. Craftworlders protect themselves in infinity circuits, yet even these fragments of consciousness resonate with the god's infinite hunger. Exodites live simply, but desire, even restrained, still radiates outward, unnoticed, feeding the god's awareness. Drukhari embrace cruelty and indulgence as survival, but every act only strengthens the eternal cycle. Across all species, the subtle pull of excess reaches even those who believe themselves untouched. Slaanesh's influence is both intimate and universal. Pleasure, obsession, and desire, once personal and fleeting, become instruments of an unending resonance. Every note of music, every work of art, every pursuit of perfection, every fleeting act of indulgence strengthens her, binds the galaxy tighter to her existence. Even those who resist are entwined, because in the warp, resistance is only another form of attention, another echo that sustains the god. Yet this is not a story of chaos in the conventional sense. There is no conquest, no armies, no war. Slaanesh is inevitable, patient, and eternal. She does not need to strike or destroy. She exists, and existence itself flows toward her. The galaxy has become a reflection of her essence, a mirror in which craving never ends, satisfaction never arrives, and desire is infinite. Every civilization, every mind, every spark of consciousness contributes, knowingly or unknowingly, to her eternal presence.